Welcome to your
The White Republic, Race, Religion, and American Nationalism.
And Ishmael Wade here with.
Hello, welcome back to Your Liberation Library. I'm Carl McRoy, your host, and I got a good friend with me, Dr. Abel Bartley of Clemson University and other fame. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us what's going on over there in South Carolina.
Thank you, Carla. I'm a professor of African American and urban history at Clemson University. Just starting my 17th year. I know I look young for that, but starting my 17th year at Clemson University. Spent 10 years at the University of Akron. I specialize in 20th century African American history, particularly the civil rights movement and African Americans' political history. So that's basically my background. I've written a couple of books on Jacksonville, Florida. Wrote in several other books. Did some work on Africa, Haile Selassie, and other things. But that's basically my background.
Good. Oh yeah. Let's get to that Jacksonville background. We gotta go into Jacksonville for a minute. Your Jaguars. All right. We have a chat. Dr. Bartley has a chat with a whole bunch of guys, and we talk trash during football season, but been quiet during the off season. What's going on?
Well, first I'll say that "we" is a French word. I just tell the truth. I think that you're invited to our Super Bowl party this year. I think the Jaguars are going to turn the world around. Now we got the great Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, with part of the urban renewal process. So each of them, Urban Meyer, every 2 years, when he's at a place, he wins a championship. So history does repeat itself on his story. And Trevor Lawrence has won championships everywhere he's gone. So like I said, y'all are invited to our Super Bowl party.
Yeah. Okay, I hear you. So urban renewal. So y'all gonna change your names to the Jacksonville Gentrifiers? But no. So does this mean that you're gonna finally be able to beat the Chiefs?
I think we will. You're gonna be surprised. I think that Patrick Mahomes.
Just stutter a little bit with that.
Patrick Mahomes is gonna have his worst day ever against that Jag defense, and the little short wide receiver is gonna think he's gonna have a Super Bowl flashback as we cover him, and so you'll see.
All right, yeah, we'll see about that. Okay, so now we're gonna jump from Jacksonville. We're gonna jump over to Alabama, because the book that we're talking about is Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington. And Dr. Bartley's going to give us some insight into the man, the myth, the legend, whether you love him or hate him. I guess there's room for all of it. Let me start it like this. Let me give you something to start it off. I was The Invisible Man. Who was that? Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. And so his character was there at Tuskegee, and he said he saw that statue of Booker T with the veil, and he said he didn't know whether he was raising it up or covering the man up with that veil. So and that kind of it was a funny moment, but it also reminded me of your written review of Booker T. And so go ahead. Is Booker T lifting up the veil of ignorance, or is he dropping it over the eyes of the man?
Booker T. Washington is probably one of the most misunderstood figures in African American history. And he's also probably one of the most controversial. I tell my classes that Booker T. Washington was the most powerful African American of the early 20th century. I mean, there's no other African American that has an entire era dedicated towards it. But Booker Washington, he was a person who would say one thing and then do the opposite. He was a master at knowing, he lived in a very perilous time, and he was a master at knowing white America, particularly white South. And a lot of the things he did were done to fit into the white South. But there's a fine line between fitting into the white South and going overboard. And oftentimes we become conflicted on whether or not Booker Washington went overboard. I started out in one place and then I moved to another place and I came back towards the middle. He's a very complicated figure. This Booker Washington is very complicated. But I think that as I've gotten older and reassessing things, I think that Booker Washington saw the limits to his possible and tried to do what he could within the limits of his power. I mean, when you think of what he did at Tuskegee, it's amazing. He used segregation to build up a school and a community that, unlike anyone else, could have done. I mean, he recognized where he was and what he was doing. So he built the school. Now, we can argue back and forth over whether or not a school based on industrial education was the kind of education that African Americans needed at that time or whatever. But he built the school and built the community. And he used elbow grease. And he was a master of telling white Southerners what they wanted to hear so that they would underwrite the things he needed to underwrite. And he had so much power because he told them what they wanted to hear. I mean, when you talk about a black guy who starts out in slavery, who has tea with the Queen of England, who has, who is having dinner with Rockefeller and Carnegie and all the wealthiest white people in America, and he's writing them and they're writing him and they're sending him checks. It must have been amazing too. I mean, it must have been a really impressive thing to think that, I started out as a slave and now here I am with my riding first class, wearing all these nice clothes and, having money and the whole 9 yards and running my own school.
Right. And so to speak of the school, now I had a visit there to Tuskegee and I mean, to think of when it began and it's still there. It's educating people as we speak. And so we certainly have to value the contribution because I mean, it's a legacy that has outlived him. I know people who have graduated from there and are in some lucrative careers, some good professions. And but tell us more about that context, because I've heard you mention this in different conversations where I didn't expect Booker T to pop up, but you bring out, hey, he had this context that he's operating in. So give us the backdrop of that.
Well, Booker Washington starts out, he goes to, he's under the tutelage of Samuel Armstrong at there in Virginia, Hampton. And he's drilled with this notion that industrial education is the key to building a race. And that what African Americans need to do, instead of starting from the top, start from the bottom and build up, instead of starting from the top and then sliding down. And so he has this concept that if I can build carpenters, teachers, people who can immediately graduate from school and earn a living, pay taxes, buy property, save their money, and become citizens, I can build a race. And so he puts this notion into action at the small school in Alabama, Tuskegee. No one thought that he was going to build the institution that he built. He used elbow grease. I mean, they made their own bricks and they sold the bricks, but he was an expert at convincing whites that, you can have your education, but let us have our education because you're going to need black carpenters, you're going to need black farmers. And so he concentrated on an industrial arts education, but he was smart. He knew that's what, white people wanted to see black people with their hands, use their hands. And so he said, I'll build you a group of people who can use their hands. But also remember, he recruited George Washington Carver, who ran the science lab. And no matter what you say about African Americans, everybody had to bow down to George Washington Carver because Carver was doing things agriculturally and scientifically that nobody else was doing. And so Washington is building this community, building this intellectual. Tuskegee has an architecture department that is doing architectural work. He's building a community and building a school based upon the idea that I want to teach people a skill that they can then take that skill, go out, get a job, earn money, buy property, and become useful parts of our society. I often have.
But he had to survive in order to be able to do it.
Right, and that was the other thing he was bringing in.
So this is the context and this is kind of where I've seen some of the big criticism of him, is that he's got communication outlets. He almost has a monopoly on African American communication in the country. And so he's being criticized for not speaking out about lynching, Ida B. Wells and others, had some words to say about him, right? So,
and that's a very good and important topic, because this is where Washington's brilliance, I think, comes through. Washington recognized he was in the deep South. He recognized that it was a dangerous situation he was in. But he also recognized, if I tell white people what they want to hear, they'll leave me alone. Washington was a person who was two people in one. He told white people one thing, he did something else, told them. There was an incident where there was a school teacher who wrote a letter about lynching. And the school teacher, the community wanted to lynch him. And the school teacher came to Tuskegee and then knocked on Booker Washington's door. And there's a lynch mob chasing him. And so the school teacher said, oh, Mr. Washington, they're about to kill me. Washington takes the school teacher in his house and hides him. And when the mob comes to Washington's door, they ask, have you seen the guy? Washington, no, I haven't seen him. Now, because they think Washington is one of them, they say, okay, cool. And they let him go. Meanwhile, Washington lets the mob go. He gets a ticket for the guy, puts him on the train, and ships him up to Chicago. And when I tell my students that, they're always shocked. What? Look at what? Washington, there's a play or a poem called The Veil. Washington lived in the veil. He knew he had to hide his right hand so that his left hand could do the stuff he was doing. And that, I think, was the most incredible thing. You would not have Marcus Garvey, who everyone looked at the economy of Booker Washington, someone who did not bow or whatever. But Marcus Garvey stole his philosophy from Booker Washington. You wouldn't have Elijah Muhammad without Booker Washington, because that's basically Booker Washington's philosophy. And so Booker Washington said, let's concentrate on building a race, building a people. He said, we're segregated. We can't fight segregation. So let's use segregation to build our community up. One thing he said that I always tell my students that was very impressive. He said, if you build a better mousetrap, nobody's gonna care what the color of the hand is that's produced. They're gonna buy it. And that was the thing he said. If we do things good and do them better, there's no way in the world they're gonna not get the stuff. And that he was sort of naive on that, but he was also sort of prescient on that, in that you push African-American excellence, but you played a role. Now, other people, the people who criticize Washington, I always tell my students, if you're in Boston, where William Monroe Trotter was, it's easy to criticize Washington. If you're in Chicago, where Ida Wells was, it's easy to criticize Washington. A lot of his critics were in the North, but, with the exception of
even had to flee to the North.
Right, or had to flee.
You mentioned Wells. I mean, she went to Chicago, not where she's from, right?
No, she's from Tennessee. She's originally from Mississippi, but she was in Tennessee and wrote about lynching. And then they burned the office down and forced her to go to Chicago. She's asking Washington to do something which she herself couldn't do. She couldn't go back to Tennessee and Memphis and teach the things that she was. Washington recognized the limits to his possible, but he worked within those limits and was able to do stuff that others could not do. And what is most impressive to me was Washington would tell, one of the things that is very controversial, he would tell what they call those darky jokes. And, you really can't defend him, but he would tell those darky jokes and everybody would laugh, ha, ha, ha. And then they'd write a $20,000 check for him, which he'd give to Black schools. And the students and I have debated a long time is that worth it? And at the time, where else were black schools going to get that kind of money? I mean, you're talking about someone like Andrew Carnegie writing a $600,000 check to Tuskegee. That's millions of dollars. You're going to talk. I mean, when you talk about Rosenwald and how when you ask why, what does the African Americans need? He said, White said we need schools, and then you get to Rosenwald Fund. Rosenwald per capita gave more money to African Americans than any other person in history. His $4 million donation to African American education would be about $1.5 billion. No one else has given African Americans that kind of money. But that's the kind of people that, that's the kind of influence Booker Washington had. He worked in circles that all of us dream about. And he was able to do things and raise land. Now I can understand Du Bois really believed that he should.
The Du Bois critique. So part of his critique wasn't even about that, but it was on the type of education, right?
Much of it was, but see, not really, because if you read Du Bois thought Washington was right on education to a point. I think I have come to believe, and I've gotten to talk to some scholars who've written on Du Bois and read them. I think in Du Bois's mind, he just could not believe that this former slave from Malden, Virginia, who graduated from Hampton, was the spokesperson for Black people, and not this guy who graduated from Harvard, studied at University of Berlin, grew up in Massachusetts. And I think part of that, with a lot of the people that did not understand why or did not like Washington, I think part of it was what the young people they call hate. And they just couldn't believe that Washington had that much power and that much authority. But Washington was controversial. Like you say, he did not speak out against lynching. He wrote some things saying that, these are not the best white people who do that kind of stuff and all that. But I think Washington recognized, I'm in Tuskegee, Alabama, the black belt, literal black belt. And if I go too far, I may be Booker Washington, and people may be coming to ask me to do favors for them. But if I get too far out the box, I'm gonna be hanging from the tree. I'm gonna be part of that strange fruit. And I think he made those kind of calculations, which makes him fairly controversial. But in building that school, the way he built the school and the way he built, his alumni, when they graduated, they sent money back. Black schools, HBCUs, that's the problem they have. Their alumni don't always donate back. Tuskegee didn't have that problem. Their alumni gave a lot of money back, and he was able to build a school based upon the alumni being very proud of being a Tuskegee graduate. And that was something that he was able to instill in people. When you go to Tuskegee, Alabama, keep in mind most of that, it wasn't just the school Tuskegee, he built the town. We wouldn't have, the Commodores and brick houses if it wasn't for Tuskegee and the pride that he instilled in a group of people in the South. He was able to do something that others couldn't do. And I think that's, and when he wrote his story, the book Up From Slavery, it clearly was not written to African Americans. This was a book written to white Americans to tell them this is what Blacks can do if you just give us half a chance. And it's very deferential. I mean, my favorite line in the book is, if I can just get my people to stop and move a limb from the road, then I've done more to build a race. You can tell that's not written to Black. That's written to what? That's written to Carnegie. Those people who read that and say, "Wow, the noble Black guy." And that's what I think the brilliance of what Washington did, and the brilliance of this book. Because when you read the book, the target audience is clearly not African American. It's white American. That's why it was a bestseller, 9 languages translated, bestseller in Europe, because people could relate to the story that he was able to tell.
So he's writing he's literally coming up out of slavery, and he's got a book translated into 9 languages. 9 languages. During his time?
During his time. Is the international bestseller. I mean, think about it. Here's a guy who had lunch. I mean, he was a slave. He had lunch with the Queen of England. He had lunch with the President of the United States. he could pick up the phone and call Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, two of the wealthiest people in the world, and say, look, I need, $15,000, and they would send it to him. He could call Wanamaker. He could call Rosenwald and say, hey, we need a school here in Clemson, South Carolina for Black kids. Could y'all do anything? And then they sent a check for $1,000. That's the kind of power that Booker Washington. And I told my students, there's no African American I know, even President Barack Obama really did not have that kind of power.
Right. So he's not just responsible for Tuskegee. He has other schools that he was Maynard, the conduit kind of their support.
Right. Here's what's misunderstood. He pushed industrial education, but he underwrote liberal arts education by getting wealthy whites to donate to Black liberal arts schools also. And that, I think, is the brilliance of Washington. Now like I said, there are controversies. I think you mentioned the fact that he controlled the press. He controlled most of the major Black papers. And so much of the information that was given to African Americans came from a positive perspective. He had his own person who was in charge of the press, who anytime anyone attacked Washington, they were very good at being his attack dog and supporting him. And so that was kind of thing that Washington was able to do. Washington could also be very vindictive. I mean, when you just look at the battle, just look at the battle between him and William Monroe Trotter, and you see the power of Booker Washington. I mean, he literally destroyed William Monroe Trotter. Look at what he did with Lucy Craft Laney when, he was supposed to give a speech and she introduced him and she, said, she sort of undermined his program. And, she ends up a little while later walking around with a tin can trying to raise money for her school in Georgia. That's the kind of thing that that's the ugly side of Washington, because he was very vindictive. But he also could be very gracious if you were on his team, if you told the line. He was also very great. And look at what he did trying to fight the Niagara movement and the NAACP. He could be, very vindictive. And so there were two people in Booker Washington, like there are two people in all of us. And you didn't want to get on his bad side.
I like that. I like that last line that you put there. Two people in him, just like there's two people in all of us. And so that's reminiscent of Romans chapter 2, where Paul says, "Who are you, O man, who judges? Because you who judge do the same thing."
That's true. Yeah.
And so the takeaways then from him and from his book. First, when you frame who his audience is white people. It's not for the slaves. He's not doing that, the recently freed, but he's doing that to raise money for the school and so forth, and to stay in the good graces. And so he's going to tell the story in that manner. So we're not going to get a Frederick Douglass type of tirade against American Christianity, because he's wanting to maintain that thing. And wow. So I knew about Tuskegee. I didn't know about him helping to fund the other universities or the other schools. And so that's good for us all to know. But so what your closing wisdom, your closing words on the life of Booker T, what we can learn from it, both good, bad, ugly.
Well, I think that Booker Washington is someone that we really, as African Americans, really need to reassess, because the question is, what should we be fighting for, and how should we be fighting for it? And I think Booker Washington answered part of that question. Washington, I have serious critiques of Washington's social program, because you should never give up rights that are guaranteed to you. And he suggests that we suspend them for a while till we could build ourselves up. One of the things Washington spent way too much time doing is critiquing the faults of African Americans and not pointing out the sins of whites. I think that's one of the critiques that I would have of Washington. The second thing, though, I would also say of Washington is he was not afraid to be self-critical and to tell African Americans things that were uncomfortable. I mean, that whole chapter on the toothbrush and bathing and cleanliness, I think those things were things that we need to hear, especially coming out of slavery, where we were trying to adjust to being a newly freed people in a newly freed world. I think as you read the things he said, he was very much so present in that he was looking at building a race that would be acceptable. Later, when we get to the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, after Washington is dead, a lot of those people are sort of picking up on, even though they say they're against Washington, they're picking up on Washington's, I want to create a high culture that African Americans will be proud of. I don't care if whites are proud of it or not. And that's what I think was sort of fueling him. You do what's right. You know, you look good for yourself. You comb your hair for yourself. He was very critical of people like Madam C.J. Walker, because he said, you all have bought into a white standard of beauty. Instead, look good for yourself. Mm-hmm. Redefine what beauty means. I think those things are very important, because that's sort of what Marcus Garvey bought in when he talked about Black is beautiful and all that. That we don't have to, I mean, if you're a dark-skinned person or a light-skinned person or whatever, be proud of what you are and what you have. And then his critiques of religion, I think, are fairly important. I mean, I think that he talked about African-American ministers and all that stuff, that I think that really caused us to reassess how we looked at church and other things. So there's so much in that book that is just so deep. And when you read it, you have to sit down and then read it again, because there's so much. It's almost like the Bible. Each time you read it, you find something new.
Right. Good. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Dr. Bartley. I look forward to you. I look forward to some more discussion with you, and keep doing what you're doing. Keep informing us, inspiring us, and challenging us. And I'll be sure to give it another look.
Can I do one last thing?
Yes,
one of my good friends is David Jackson, Dr. David Jackson of Florida A&M University, and he wrote a book on Washington's educational tours. And Washington did a bunch of educational tours in the early 1900s to show the progress that the race had made 35 years after slavery. And that's where we got Lift Every Voice and Sing, because when he came to Jacksonville, James Weldon Johnson wanted to celebrate it by writing, he wrote the poem, then his brother turned it into a song. But I think that Washington was very brilliant in that he wanted to advertise, look, you have made a mistake by making African Americans slaves. Look at the potential we had. If you read his book, The Man Farthest Down, he talks about comparing African American progress to people in Europe who had been free and had less restrictions, and yet African Americans had surpassed them in a lot of ways, intellectually and economically and those things. And I think that when you look at him, he's clearly someone who's very proud of being African American and want the world to recognize that there's innate talent in African Americans, and we're wasting that innate talent.
That's a good way to end it. Appreciate you, Doctor. Take care.
Always a pleasure.